The sea was dying. Gray waves lapped quietly against the coral edge of the island, carrying with them scraps of driftwood, oil, and the smell of defeat. By April 1945, Japan's empire had shrunk to a scattering of starving outposts, and the soldiers who held them were ghosts in uniform, thin, driven by orders no one could follow anymore. On one of those outposts, an island so small it barely showed up on Allied maps, a platoon of Japanese troops waited for the end. They hadn't eaten in 3 days. Private crouched behind a rock, staring at the horizon. The sea was calm, deceptively calm. His hands shook as he held a rusted mess tin. Inside it, there was nothing but a layer of mold and seawater. A few yards away, Sergeant was whispering over a map that no longer made sense, lines and arrows pointing toward units that no longer existed. "Command says we hold," muttered. Almost laughed. Hold what? There was no command anymore. No radios, no supplies, no messages from Tokyo. Only the endless blue of the Pacific and the sound of American bombers somewhere beyond the clouds. They were supposed to die here. That was what the Emperor's last order had meant. No surrender, no shame. But hunger was a patient enemy. It broke discipline the way the tide broke coral, slowly, invisibly, until everything was hollow. By dusk, the men of the 18th Independent Regiment were no longer soldiers. They were survivors. Their skin clung to bone, their eyes were too large for their faces. They boiled grass and drank rainwater. They prayed for a ship that would never come. And then one morning, something impossible appeared on the beach. A crate. It had drifted in from the sea, corners by salt. The kanji painted on its side were English letters instead. Drew his bayonet and split it open. Inside were tins, round, shiny, sealed with bright labels. American food. Peaches, corned beef, crackers. The smell of syrup hit them like a hallucination. For a long moment, no one moved. The men just stared, their hunger warring with everything they'd been taught. To eat the enemy's food was to defile the Emperor's trust. It was surrender without words. But then Corporal, whose younger brother had starved in the Philippines, reached in and opened one tin with his teeth. The syrup ran down his chin. No one stopped him. No one could. By nightfall, the crate was empty. That was the first drop. The next morning, there were 3 more. They floated in, bobbing gently on the tide, carried by unseen currents. Each one was stenciled with the same symbol, a white star, and a note tied in waterproof plastic. For survivors, no weapons, food only. The handwriting was clumsy, but the meaning was clear. It came from the enemy. Held the note for a long time, saying nothing. Then he tore it to pieces and threw it into the fire. "We don't take mercy from Americans," he said, but even he ate that night. Weeks passed, the crates kept coming. Sometimes they washed in with the tide. Sometimes they dropped from the sky, small parachutes billowing white against the clouds. Each one was filled with rations, medical kits, water filters. It was enough to keep the men alive, but not enough to explain why. At first, they thought it was a trick. Poisoned food, maybe. A way to humiliate the last Japanese holdouts before finishing them, but nothing happened. The tins were clean, the medical packs real. It was food meant for survival. Then one morning, while foraging near the beach, saw it, an American landing craft offshore, small, unarmed, flying a white flag. The tide carried it closer. 2 men stood on its deck. And one of them waved. Froze, his training screamed at him to shoot, but he couldn't lift his rifle. The man waving wasn't carrying a weapon. He was holding something wrapped in cloth. When the craft beached, the man stepped into the surf, water up to his knees. His uniform was American, but faded, worn. He looked like he'd been at war forever. He shouted something in English, then again, slower. Didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't command, it wasn't threat. It was offering. Appeared behind him, rifle raised. "Don't move," he hissed. The American stopped. Slowly he unwrapped the bundle in his hands. Inside was bread, fresh, still warm from a galley oven. The smell hit like a memory. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Japanese soldiers in rags staring at a man who should have been their enemy, holding out food like communion. Then, in broken Japanese, the American said something that made throat close. "Eat no more fighting, war almost over." Almost over. Those words hit harder than any bullet, lowered his rifle an inch. Around him, the others stood frozen, torn between disbelief and exhaustion. stepped forward first. Slowly, as if moving underwater, he took a piece of the bread. It was soft. He bit into it. Tears filled his eyes. Behind him, someone whispered a prayer. That night, the platoon shared the bread in silence. No one spoke of shame or emperor or surrender. For the first time in years, they slept without fear of dying in their sleep. And when the next dawn came, the white flag boat was gone. But new crates floated in with the tide, more food, bandages, letters with careful English handwriting. One line kept appearing in every note. "We can't fight hunger." The Japanese soldiers didn't know the name of the man who sent them. They never learned his unit or his rank. All they knew was that he came from the side of the war they were taught to hate, and yet he fed them. When the imperial surrender finally came months later, wrote in his journal, "The Americans didn't win because they had better weapons. They won because they had mercy. And mercy is harder than war." He was right, because the story of the enemy who fed them would travel farther than any bullet, whispering through the ruins of Japan as proof that even in the darkest war humanity had ever known. There were moments when the human heart broke through the orders, the hatred, the fear. Moments when compassion was the most dangerous weapon of all. The bread tasted like forgiveness. For days after that first meeting, and the remnants of his platoon waited by the shore, staring at the horizon as if another miracle might drift in from the blue. The tide carried wreckage, now broken oars, shredded uniforms, the bones of war itself, but no more boats. No more men waving white flags. The Americans had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. But their gifts remained. The crates still came, not every day and never enough to grow comfortable, but enough to live. Sometimes the crates bore notes written in strange, careful English. Sometimes they carried nothing but food sealed in perfect rows. The sergeant made a ritual of it. Each time a new crate appeared, he would open it alone, inspect the contents, and distribute the rations in silence. The others pretended not to notice that he always kept the notes for himself. One night found him by the dying campfire, the latest note clenched in his hand. Was staring at it as if it were a weapon. Crouched beside him and whispered, "What do they say?" Didn't look up, his voice was hoarse. "They say we should go home." The words struck harder than gunfire. Home, the word itself had become almost mythic. For 3 years, the soldiers of Japan had been told that home was wherever they fought, that dying in service to the emperor was the only path that mattered. But now, as the island rotted beneath them and the war turned into whispers, the idea of going home felt like blasphemy and salvation all at once. Stared into the dark. "You think it's true?" His hand trembled. He crushed the paper into his fist. "Truth is for the living." The next morning, they found the beach covered in fish. Hundreds of them, silvery and small, washed ashore after a storm. It was a gift nature hadn't offered in months. The men scrambled to gather them, half laughing, half crying. They built a fire, roasted the catch, and ate until their hands were slick with oil. For a few hours, the island felt alive again. But as they ate, one of the younger soldiers, Private, noticed something floating beyond the reef. Not a crate, something larger. A boat. It drifted closer, rocking with the waves. Its paint was faded, its motor silent. The white flag fluttered again, and in its bow sat the same man had seen before, the American with kind eyes and the quiet face of someone who had seen too much. This time he wasn't alone. Another soldier sat beside him, hands raised, showing he carried no weapon. His uniform was Japanese, filthy, patched, but unmistakable. The men on the beach gasped, barked, "Hold your fire," and stepped forward, rifle half raised, eyes locked on the stranger. The man in the Japanese uniform called out first, his voice trembling but clear. "I'm Lieutenant. I surrendered last month. They brought me here. They said you're still fighting ghosts." The words froze everyone where they stood. Behind him, the American said something in English, his tone calm, almost gentle. Translated haltingly. "He says the war is over. Tokyo has surrendered. You don't have to die here." No one spoke. The air seemed to thicken with disbelief. The men stared at their commander, their anchor. His jaw worked, but no sound came. Finally, he shouted, "Lies, all of it," and fired a single shot into the air. The echo cracked like thunder across the waves. The American didn't flinch, he just waited. Then slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small. A newspaper, or what was left of one. The front showed a photograph of Emperor Hirohito speaking into a microphone. Had never seen his face before. None of them had. The emperor was mortal, standing like any man, his hand gripping the paper, his mouth open mid-speech. The caption below read, "Japan surrenders, war ends." The sound of the surf swallowed everything else. Dropped his rifle. For the first time, he looked old. That night, the men gathered around the fire, the newspaper spread between them like a sacred relic. The edges had already begun to fray from the damp air. No one dared touch it. "We lost," whispered. "No," said quietly, "we survived." The words felt heavy, as if saying them out loud might summon shame. For years, they had been told surrender was worse than death. Now, death had become meaningless. What did shame matter if you were still breathing? The next morning, the Americans returned. This time, they came in force, not with guns, but with stretchers, medics, translators, and food. They landed carefully, wary of ambush, but there was no ambush to meet them. Stood in the surf as the landing craft touched sand. He recognized the first man to step off, the same one with the kind eyes, the one who had given them bread. The American extended a hand. For a heartbeat, hesitated, then slowly he took it. It felt like touching something forbidden and holy all at once. The first handshake between enemies who had spent years trying to kill each other. The American smiled faintly and said something in English barely understood. "You're safe now." And just like that, the war ended, not with a gunshot, but with a handshake. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese soldiers were evacuated. The Americans built a small camp at the edge of the beach. They shared food, medicine, even cigarettes. For men who had been taught to hate each other, it felt like living inside a dream. At night, would sit beside the fire with one of the American medics, a tall man named Jack Whitman from Kansas. Jack had a quiet way about him. When he spoke, it was slow, deliberate, like a man who knew the cost of words. One evening asked, Why help us?" Jack thought for a long moment before answering. "Because the war over," he said. "And if we keep killing each other after it's done, what was the point?" He looked up at the stars, eyes distant. "You know, I used to think mercy was weakness, but maybe it's the only thing that keeps us from becoming what we fight." Didn't reply, he didn't need to. The truth was in the silence between them, the kind of silence that feels like understanding. By the time they left the island, the Americans had buried their dead beside the Japanese. Two flags, the stars and stripes and the rising sun, fluttered side by side in the humid wind. When boarded the ship home, he turned back to look one last time. The beach was empty again, the tide washing clean over the footprints of soldiers who had once been enemies. The crates still floated there, bobbing in the surf, bright against the gray water. And for the first time, realized something simple and devastating. They hadn't been enemies at all, just men, hungry and afraid, trying to stay human in a world that had forgotten how. The sea had gone quiet again, too quiet, almost reverent. The war was over, and yet the silence that followed felt heavier than the sound of guns. The men who had survived now drifted between two worlds, one where they had been warriors, and another where they were simply men who'd been spared. For and his comrades, being alive, felt both miraculous and unbearable. They had outlived the purpose they had once been ready to die for. The Americans called them repatriates. To the Japanese government, they were remnants, soldiers who should have died but hadn't. When stepped off the transport ship in Yokohama Harbor that autumn, the air smelled of smoke and seawater. The city was unrecognizable, a skeleton of brick and ash. What had once been streets were now charred paths through ruins. Children with hollow eyes scavenged through debris for anything that could burn. He stood there for a long time, his duffel bag hanging from one shoulder, the sea wind tugging at his tattered uniform. Behind him, others shuffled in silence. No cheers greeted them, no flags, no homecoming songs, only the creak of the dock and the caw of distant crows. A woman passed by carrying a bundle of wood. She looked up her expression unreadable. When her eyes fell on the patch of his old regiment still clinging to his sleeve, she turned away. They weren't heroes anymore. They were reminders of everything Japan wanted to forget. That night slept in a makeshift hostel built from the remains of a warehouse. The walls still bore scorch marks from the air raids. Dozens of men lay on the floor around him, their breath slow and shallow. Some whispered names in their sleep, some clutched old photographs. In the corner, Sergeant sat awake, staring at nothing. His hair had gone white in patches. The iron had left his voice. He looked smaller, thinner, like a man carved out of memory. "You ever think about them?" asked quietly. Didn't answer right away. His hand moved to his coat pocket where he kept one of the American notes, the one with the words, "We can't fight hunger." He had never thrown it away. Finally, he said, "Every night," he glanced at, "you think they'll remember us." Thought of the American soldier with the calm eyes, the man who had fed them. He didn't even know his name, but he could still see him, standing knee-deep in the surf, holding bread instead of a rifle. "Yes," said softly, "someone will remember." Weeks passed. The surviving men scattered across Japan, trying to rebuild lives that no longer fit. Returned to Osaka, where he found his family's home gone, burned in a raid the year before. He never wrote again. Went north to Sendai, where his sister still lived. She was thinner than he remembered, but alive. Her husband had died in the firebombing, leaving behind a son, a boy of 5 with sharp eyes and no memory of peace. For months, barely spoke. He worked at a rice warehouse, carrying sacks heavier than himself. Every time he touched the coarse grain, he thought of the island, of the empty crates, the salt wind, the Americans who had fed them. It haunted him. Sometimes at night he would dream of that beach. The sea was always gray. The Americans were faceless now, their voices echoing in English he could no longer translate. In the dream, the bread they offered turned to ash in his hands, and still he ate it because hunger was worse than shame. He woke every time in a sweat, whispering the same word. "I'm sorry." In the spring of 1946, he found himself walking along the coast near his village. The ocean spread endlessly before him, calm and indifferent. Fishermen worked nearby, mending nets, their laughter light, something he hadn't heard in years. Then he saw it. Half buried in the sand was a rusted crate, broken open by the tide. The letters had faded, but he recognized them instantly. U.S. Army RATIONS. It must have drifted here years ago, carried by the same current that had once saved him. He knelt beside it, brushing away sand until his fingers found a scrap of paper wedged inside. The writing was nearly gone, the ink blurred by salt, but one sentence was still clear. "If you're reading this, you survived, that's all that matters." Sat there for a long time, the wind pulling at his hair. He thought about the man who had written those words, a man who had crossed an ocean to fight him, then chosen mercy instead. A man whose kindness had survived where armies hadn't. And he began to understand something his country had never taught him. That survival was not weakness. Mercy was not surrender. Mercy was strength, the kind that demanded you let go of hate. The next week traveled to Tokyo. The city was rubble, but life pulsed beneath it, markets built from scavenged wood, families rebuilding from ashes. In a small district near, he found a church that had somehow survived the bombings. The sign out front read in English, "Chapel of Reconciliation." Inside, a group of people knelt in prayer, Japanese civilians and a few American soldiers in uniform. The sight stopped him cold. For a moment, he thought he had walked into a dream. At the front stood a chaplain, reading softly from a Bible in halting Japanese. Beside him sat a young woman playing a battered piano. The sound was thin, broken, but beautiful. When the service ended, the chaplain noticed lingering in the back and approached him. He was tall, with graying hair and eyes that held that same calm strength remembered from the beach. "You were in the war?" the man asked gently. Nodded. "I was, on one of the islands." The chaplain studied him. "You look like you've carried that island home with you." Smiled faintly. "Maybe I have," he hesitated. "Did you ever serve in the Pacific?" The chaplain's expression softened. "Yes, I was with the 41st Division. We did relief work after the fighting, fed who we could." Felt the words like a tremor in his chest. "Fed," he whispered. "You mean the drops, the crates?" The chaplain nodded slowly. "Sometimes the enemy looked hungrier than our own men. The war didn't make sense anymore. Feeding them did." His voice broke. "I think you saved my life." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the chaplain placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let's both keep feeding others," he said softly. "That's how we win the peace." In the months that followed, volunteered at the church. They distributed food to orphans, helped rebuild homes, and visited families who had lost everything. Sometimes American soldiers joined them. Sometimes former Japanese officers came too, their shame melting into quiet gratitude. One afternoon, as they handed out bread to a line of children, a little boy asked him, "Are they our enemies?" Looked at the Americans unloading boxes from a truck. Then he knelt and shook his head. "No," he said gently. "They were, but not anymore. Now they're the people who feed us." The boy frowned. Why would the enemy feed us? Smiled, because sometimes, even enemies remember they are human. Years later, when he had children of his own, told them the story, not of battles or medals, but of the day their enemies fed them. He described the beach, the crates, the bread, the handshake. He ended every telling the same way. War teaches you how to hate. Mercy teaches you how to live. And though the world would go on to fight new wars, his children carried that lesson like a secret inheritance, that the truest victory isn't survival or conquest. It's the moment when you look at the enemy across the water and see yourself. The photograph was small, grainy, and nearly worn through at the edges. It showed a man standing knee-deep in the surf, his uniform rolled up to the knees, holding out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Behind him, the sky glared white with Pacific light. In the foreground, just barely visible, were a few Japanese soldiers, gaunt and motionless, watching him from the beach. It was the only picture ever taken of that moment. Found it years later in an American magazine, tucked away in a feature called Mercy in War, Stories of Compassion from the Pacific. He froze when he saw it. The caption read, "Corporal Jack Whitman of the U.S. 40, 1st Infantry Division delivers food to starving Japanese holdouts, 1945. Jack Whitman. The name struck him like a bell he had been hearing in dreams for years. He ran his fingers over the image again and again, tracing the blurred face of the man who had fed them. It had been almost a decade, but the eyes were the same, calm, kind, steady. The eyes of a man who had looked across the line between life and death and chosen mercy. Wrote to the magazine. In careful, hesitant English, he asked for Whitman's address. He wasn't sure if the letter would ever reach him or if the man was even still alive. He only knew that he needed to say thank you not for saving his life, but for saving something deeper. For proving that humanity had survived the war when so many thought it hadn't. 2 months later, a letter arrived. The envelope was thin, the paper yellowed, but the handwriting was strong and even. It began, "Dear Mr. I remember the island, I remember the faces. I never thought I'd hear from one of you again." Read the letter in silence, the words swimming in his vision. "We weren't supposed to help you. Orders were clear, no contact, no aid, no risk. But we couldn't watch men starve anymore. The war had already taken enough. We figured the ocean could be our messenger, so we sent the food by tide. We never thought you'd find out who sent it." At the end, Whitman had written one simple line. "You weren't our enemies anymore, you were just hungry." Folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his bed. That night, for the first time in years, he slept without dreams. In 1955, traveled to the United States. He was part of a cultural exchange program. Japan's new government wanted to show goodwill, and veterans like him were symbols of reconciliation. The flight took nearly a full day. When he stepped off the plane in San Francisco, the light felt different, colder but softer. The air smelled of oil, salt, and possibility. He carried only one address in his pocket. Jack Whitman, 311 East 4th Street, Topeka, Kansas. The train cut through endless plains, fields of wheat, small towns flashing past like memories. He thought of his island again, the black sand, the sun, the smell of salt and metal, how small it had felt, how infinite. When he reached Topeka, he was surprised by its quiet. It wasn't like Tokyo, which pulsed with rebuilding. Topeka felt still, solid, like a place untouched by war. The streets were clean, the air thick with the smell of corn and dust. He asked a shopkeeper for directions, clutching the slip of paper in his hand. She pointed toward a modest white house with a garden and a flag fluttering gently out front. When he knocked, the door opened almost immediately. Jack Whitman looked older, grayer hair, a limp in his step, but those eyes were unmistakable. The same quiet calm, the same steadiness that had once reached across an ocean. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with 10 years of unspoken history. Then Jack smiled, that slow, careful smile. "You made it," he said. Bowed deeply, unable to speak. His throat was tight, his chest trembling. Jack motioned him inside. The house smelled of tobacco and books. On the wall hung a framed version of the same photograph from the magazine, the one of the bread, the sea, the moment that had rewritten everything. They sat at the kitchen table, two men who had once been enemies. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was full of everything they didn't need to explain. Finally spoke. "Why did you do it back then, when the orders said not to?" Jack leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. "We'd been fighting for 3 years. I'd seen too many good men die for land nobody even remembered the name of. That day on the beach when we saw your camp through the binoculars, you didn't look like soldiers. You looked like ghosts. I figured if I could feed you, maybe I could feed something in myself too. Something I didn't want the war to kill." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once held bread instead of bullets. It wasn't heroism, it was just being tired of hate. Nodded slowly. "You know, for years after I couldn't eat bread without thinking of you." Jack chuckled softly. "Guess we both learned to live with ghosts." Over the next few days, stayed with Jack and his family. Jack's wife was warm and curious, fascinated by the quiet Japanese man who had come across the ocean just to say thank you. Jack's son, only 8 years old, asked endless questions about the war. "Did my dad shoot at you?" the boy asked once bluntly. Smiled faintly. "No," he said, "your father saved me." The boy frowned. "But you were the enemy." Looked out the window where the Kansas wind rippled across fields that seemed to stretch forever. "Yes," he said softly, "but mercy has no enemies." The boy didn't understand then, but maybe one day he would. On last night in Kansas, the two men sat outside on the porch. The stars were vast and bright, the same stars that had hung over the Pacific a decade before. The cicadas sang. The air smelled faintly of rain. Jack spoke first. "You know, I kept wondering if any of you made it. They told us later some did. We hoped." "We did," said, "and we remembered." Jack turned toward him. "Then I guess it was worth it." "It was," said, "more than you know." They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of metal, weathered and scratched. "I kept this," he said. "From that day, a bolt from one of the crates we sent, figured it belonged to you." Took it gently. It was nothing, just rusted steel, pitted by salt and time. But to him it was everything. He bowed again, deeply, almost trembling. "You gave me life," he said. "Let me give you something, too." He reached into his coat and took out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of his sister and nephew standing outside their rebuilt home in Sendai. On the back, he had written in neat English, "Because you fed me, they lived." Jack read it slowly, then looked up. His eyes glistened in the porch light. He didn't say anything, he just nodded. The next morning they said goodbye at the station. The train whistle echoed like a heartbeat. Jack extended his hand. This time didn't hesitate. Their handshake was firm, the second in their lives and the one that truly sealed peace between them. As the train pulled away, leaned out the window and saw Jack standing there, hand raised in farewell. Behind him, the wheat fields shimmered gold under the morning sun, a color that, in black and white memories, had never existed before. For the first time realized that peace, too, had a color. It was the color of forgiveness. It was the color of bread. When returned to Japan, he carried more than luggage. He carried the weight of something invisible, something that felt both lighter than air and heavier than the world itself. Forgiveness. Tokyo was a different city now. Neon lights were rising where ruins had been. Streetcars rattled through alleys once filled with smoke and rubble. And on every corner there were children, loud, hungry, alive, the first generation born after the war. But for men like, peace was not just survival. It was a mirror, one that reflected everything you had done to deserve it. He had seen the enemy feed him. He had shaken hands with the man who'd crossed the line between hatred and humanity. And now, as Japan remade itself, found himself asking a question he couldn't escape. What does mercy look like when the war is over? He started working at a small newspaper in Sendai, writing human interest stories, the kind most people ignored. He wrote about the fishermen who rebuilt their boats from scrap metal, the women who turned burned fields into rice paddies again, the orphans who scavenged junk to buy school uniforms. But one story haunted him most. A former soldier, a man named, had returned from the Philippines. He had lost everything: his family, his village, his reason for living. When met him, he lived under a bridge near the river, carving small birds out of driftwood. Each bird had wings outstretched, like it was flying away. "They used to tell us we'd go to heaven if we died for the emperor," said one day, his hands working the knife with mechanical precision. "Turns out, heaven's a lot quieter when you live instead." Wrote his story. It was published under the headline, "The Soldiers Who Chose to Live." It drew hundreds of letters, some praising his honesty, others condemning it as shameful. Old veterans still clung to pride, but the new Japan was beginning to see things differently. For the first time, survival wasn't cowardice, it was courage. In 1957, received another letter from Kansas. Jack Whitman's handwriting had grown shakier, but the words were the same: deliberate, thoughtful, unhurried. "My boy, grown up now," Jack wrote. "He enlisted last year, said he wants to see the world. I didn't stop him, but I told him whatever uniform he wears, don't let it make him forget he's human." At the bottom of the letter, Jack had drawn a small sketch, a loaf of bread split in half, steam rising. Beside it, he wrote, "Still sharing," smiled through tears. He placed the letter beside the one Jack had sent years before and lit a candle. The flame flickered like a heartbeat, alive, fragile, persistent. The years passed. Japan rebuilt. The American occupation ended. The world moved into a new kind of war, one cold, invisible, and endless. But too, the lessons of the last war never faded. He began to speak at schools, telling students about the island, about the bread, about the man who had fed them. Most of the children listened politely, but without understanding. They had grown up in a world where America was no longer the enemy, just another country on the radio. Once after a lecture, a teenage boy approached him. "Sir," he said, "if the Americans fed you, doesn't that mean they you?" Paused. "Maybe they did," he said. "But pity feeds the stomach, mercy feeds the soul, that's what saved us." The boy frowned, thoughtful. "Do you still hate them?" Looked out the classroom window. In the distance, a jetliner crossed the sky, its silver wings glinting in sunlight. "No," he said softly. "How can you hate the hand that fed you?" The more he spoke, the more invitations came. Universities, veterans groups, churches. Once he was even invited to a military academy where he stood before young officers in crisp uniforms and told them that the hardest lesson in war wasn't courage, it was compassion. "Anyone can fight," he said, "but only the brave can forgive." When the lecture ended, a young cadet approached him, his voice trembling. "My grandfather fought in the Pacific," he said. "He never spoke about it. I think he might been one of the men who dropped those crates." Felt his throat tighten. "Then your grandfather was braver than most generals." The cadet nodded, blinking rapidly. "Thank you for surviving." That night walked through the streets of Tokyo. Neon lights glowed like constellations. The war felt impossibly far away, a dream the world had half forgotten. Yet as he passed a bakery, the smell of bread stopped him cold. He stepped inside. The shelves were lined with loaves, warm, golden, perfect. A young woman behind the counter smiled. "Fresh from the oven," she said cheerfully. "Would you like to try one?" He nodded, bought a loaf, and stepped back into the cool evening air. He tore off a piece and took a bite. It was soft, almost sweet. For a moment, he was back on the island, the salt wind in his hair, the gray surf licking at the sand, the sound of English words he hadn't understood, but somehow had always known the meaning of. Eat, no more fighting, war almost over. He stood there on the sidewalk, eyes closed, letting the taste fill him. Then he broke the loaf in half and handed a piece to a beggar sitting nearby. The man looked up in surprise. Smiled gently. "Eat," he said, "no more fighting." Decades later, in 1972, he received one final letter from Kansas. The handwriting was different now, younger but familiar. "Dear Mr. My father, Jack Whitman, passed away last month. Before he died, he told me to find you. He said you'd understand something he never could put into words. I'm enclosing something he wanted you to have." Inside the envelope was a small brass compass. On the back, engraved in careful letters, were 3 words. "Toward the light." Closed his eyes. The tears came quietly like rain. He remembered that last morning in Kansas, Jack's hand waving goodbye, the wheat fields glowing gold in the dawn. He placed the compass beside his candle and whispered a prayer. Not for the dead, but for the living, for those still learning what mercy meant. In his final years, wrote a book, not a memoir, but a collection of stories called The Bread and the Sea. Each chapter told a fragment of the war through acts of compassion. A nurse saving an enemy child, a sailor rescuing a downed pilot, a soldier refusing to pull a trigger. He wrote in the preface, "History remembers victory, humanity remembers kindness. I choose to remember kindness." The book never sold much, but in time it found its way into classrooms where students underlined its last line again and again. When the enemy fed us, we stopped being enemies. The last photograph ever taken of showed him standing on a beach at sunrise, an old man in a white shirt, holding a small loaf of bread in his hands. The waves curled around his feet, and behind him the horizon was glowing, a pale, endless light. He was smiling, and though no one could hear it over the crash of the waves, those who stood nearby swore they heard him whisper, "War ends when hunger does." The winter wind carried the smell of salt and rust along Japan's eastern coast, mingling with the faint smoke of fishing boats returning from the sea. Stood on a small pier, older now, his posture bent but unbroken. In his gloved hand, he held the brass compass Jack Whitman's son had sent him years ago. Its surface had dulled with time, but when the light struck just right, the engraved words still gleamed faintly toward the light. He turned it over in his palm, watching the needle tremble. It always pointed the same way, steady, certain, patient. He admired that. There was something beautiful about an instrument that never lost its sense of direction, even when the person holding it did. Behind him, the village was alive again. Children ran along the beach where bomb craters had once gaped open. Fishermen shouted greetings from the docks. Someone was baking bread. The smell drifted faintly across the shore, soft and warm. It had been nearly 30 years since the day the enemy fed them. 3 decades since the crates floated in on the tide. And yet, in the quiet of his heart, still felt that moment as if it had happened yesterday. He walked slowly up the hill toward a small building overlooking the sea. It wasn't a temple, though people sometimes prayed there. It was a memorial, simple, weathered, and small. On the front wall hung a bronze plaque with words written in both Japanese and English. "To those who remembered mercy when the world forgot it." Below the inscription stood 2 flags, side by side, the rising sun and the stars and stripes. Every year on the anniversary of the surrender, villagers gathered there, not to celebrate, not to mourn, to remember. Inside, the walls were lined with names, Japanese and American. Soldiers, medics, pilots, engineers, Seabees, the kind of men who built and destroyed in the same breath, who carried both weapons and compassion. Among the artifacts displayed was a single rusted tin crate preserved behind glass. The sign beneath it read, "Found on the shore 1945, contained food, not bullets." Placed his hand gently on the glass. He could still feel the cold metal through it, as though the sea's memory lingered in the steel. He remembered the hunger, the trembling hands, the first bite of bread. He remembered how it had tasted like disbelief. A young woman entered the room behind him, her voice soft. "Mr." He turned. It was his granddaughter, barely 20, studying international relations in Tokyo. She visited every year to bring flowers to the memorial. In her hands was a small bouquet of white lilies. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, bowing slightly. "The trains were delayed." He smiled faintly. The sea waits longer than trains do. Placed the flowers beneath the plaque and stood beside him. For a moment they both stared at the twin flags swaying gently in the cold draft. "Grandfather," she asked, "is it true that the Americans gave you food even when you were enemies?" "Yes," said simply. "They fed us when we didn't even think we deserved it." "But why?" He looked at her, his eyes shining with the soft, gray wisdom of old age. "Because mercy doesn't need a reason." That night after dinner, sat near the window watching snow fall over the dark sea. Joined him, a cup of tea in her hands. The lamp light cast soft halos on the glass, and the reflection of his face looked almost like a ghost, thin, translucent, peaceful. "Grandfather," she said quietly, "in school they tell us Japan rebuilt because of hard work, that we learned from defeat. But you always talk about kindness. Was it really that important?" He turned the compass over in his fingers, the needle quivering like a heartbeat. "Work builds nations," he said. "Kindness builds people." He pointed to the compass. Do you know why I carry this? She shook her head. It belonged to an American soldier. He sent it to me after my friend Jack passed away. See what it says. She leaned closer. Toward the light, she read aloud. Nodded. When you lose everything, your home, your pride, your faith, you can still walk toward the light. That's what he taught me. That mercy isn't weakness, it's direction. Listened, her eyes glistening. I want to tell that story, she said. I want people my age to know it. He smiled softly. Then tell it well, tell it so the hungry believe it. A few weeks later, wrote an article for her university journal. She titled it The Enemy Who Fed Us, Lessons from My Grandfather's War. It opened with a quote had once told her. The war ended when the bread arrived. The article spread quickly across campuses. Students shared it. Teachers read it aloud in lectures about history, ethics, and humanity. It reached people far beyond Japan, across oceans, across borders. Some readers wrote letters saying it reminded them of their own grandparents. Others said they cried reading it. One letter came from a man in Topeka, Kansas. He introduced himself as David Whitman, Jack's grandson. Your grandfather's story, he wrote, is part of ours too. My grandfather always told us that his proudest moment wasn't the day the war ended, it was the day he fed the enemy. Thank you for remembering him. When read the letter, his hands trembled. It was as if time itself had folded, bridging two families separated by oceans and decades. The following spring, David Whitman came to Japan. He was a tall man in his 40s, carrying the same quiet expression his grandfather once had. When he met, he bowed awkwardly but deeply. My grandfather always wanted to see this place, David said, his voice thick. I thought maybe I could bring a part of him here. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a handful of soil. From his garden back home, David explained. He used to grow wheat, said he never forgot how precious food was. Took the box in both hands, his voice barely a whisper. Then let's give him a place to rest. They walked together up the hill to the memorial. Side by side, the two men sprinkled the Kansas soil at the foot of the plaque, where the white lilies from last visit had already begun to wilt. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind whistled softly through the pine trees. The ocean stretched below them, endless, calm, blue-gray under the morning light. Finally said, he fed us with bread. You feed us with remembrance, both keep the heart alive. David smiled faintly. He would liked you, mister. He already did, replied. That evening they sat outside small home, watching the horizon fade to silver. Joined them serving tea. The three generations, two families, once enemies, shared the quiet peace of people who had finally run out of reasons to hate. David turned to, when I tell people back home this story, they always ask me one thing. How could two sides that fought so hard ever find forgiveness? Looked toward the sea, his voice low but firm. Because mercy doesn't erase what we did, he said. It just refuses to let it happen again. He held up the compass one last time, the brass glinting faintly in the dying light. You see this? It never stops pointing north no matter how you turn it. That's what kindness is. Even in war, even in hunger, it knows where home is. That night when went to bed, the compass rested beside his pillow. Outside, the waves whispered against the shore. In his dreams, he was back on the island again, the same beach, the same sea, but this time the crates weren't falling from the sky. Instead, they floated outward, away from him, carrying bread into the horizon, toward others he couldn't see. And in that dream, he realized something he'd never understood before. Mercy isn't something you receive, it's something you pass on. The years slipped by quietly, like the tide retreating from the shore. By the 1980s, the small fishing village where lived had changed beyond recognition. The harbor had become a marina. Children played video games instead of chasing crabs. And yet, every August 15th, the anniversary of Japan's surrender, the villagers still gathered at the seaside memorial. They still laid flowers beneath the twin flags. They still remembered the bread that came from the sea. Was old now nearly blind, his hair thin and white, his steps slow but steady. He could no longer make the climb to the memorial on his own, so would take his arm each year, leading him up the narrow path. Each step was deliberate, as though the earth itself remembered his weight. That morning the air was soft and warm. The cicadas hummed in the pines. As they reached the top, paused, catching his breath. The bronze plaque gleamed faintly in the sunlight. He reached out and traced the letters with his fingertips, feeling the cold metal under his skin. To those who remembered mercy when the world forgot it. He smiled. "It's still here," he murmured. Nodded, "and it always will be." That evening, the town held a small gathering in the community hall. Villagers, students, and visitors from abroad filled the space. Among them was David Whitman, older now, gray at the temples, but still carrying that same gentle calm that seemed to run in his family. He had brought his own son with him this time, a young man named Tom, a pilot in the U.S. Air Force. Tom stood by the window, looking at the sea that had once divided their nations. "It's strange," he said softly. "My grandfather fought here, my father visited here, and now I'm standing here not as a soldier but as a guest." Chuckled. "History likes circles," he said. "It keeps drawing us back until we finally understand what it was trying to teach." Tom nodded, eyes wide with quiet reverence. "I think I'm starting to understand." As night fell, the villagers lit paper lanterns and released them into the water. Each lantern bore a single word written in black ink: peace, memory, mercy, home. The glowing orbs drifted across the dark surface, their reflections trembling like stars fallen into the sea. Stood beside her grandfather, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Do you see them?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Not with my eyes, but I feel the light." David joined them, holding one last lantern. He handed it to. "This one's for Jack," he said softly. Touched the paper carefully. His fingers brushed the faint characters written in English. Toward the light. They knelt together at the water's edge. The lantern bobbed once, twice, then drifted outward, carried by the tide. The glow dimmed slowly until it became just another star among the others. For a long while, no one spoke. The waves whispered against the rocks, carrying the past out into the dark and bringing peace back in with every returning swell. In the following years, health declined, but his mind, that quiet, steady compass, never faltered. He continued to write, filling notebooks with thoughts, memories, and small sketches of the sea. He called them letters to tomorrow. Most were addressed not to people, but to ideas. To mercy, may you never be mistaken for weakness. To hunger, may you remind us what it means to need. To enemies, may you live long enough to become friends. He wrote until his hands shook too much to hold a pen. Then one morning in early spring, he didn't wake up. His funeral was simple, just as he had asked. The villagers carried his ashes to the memorial hill overlooking the sea. The sky was clear, the water calm, the air filled with birdsong. David Whitman flew from Kansas again, bringing a small bag of soil, wheat earth, golden and dry, from the same field his grandfather had once worked. Together with, he mixed it with the sand at the base of the memorial. "Now," David said quietly, "the bread and the sea are one again." Years passed. The world moved further away from the memory of war. Japan and the United States became allies, trading partners, friends. Tourists came to the village not for the fishing, but for the story of the crates, the bread, and the mercy that crossed an ocean. The memorial became a museum, became its curator. Every year on the anniversary of the war's end, she would stand before visitors, veterans, travelers, and tell them what her grandfather had taught her. She would hold up the compass he'd left behind, its brass gleaming under the light, and say, "This compass doesn't point north, it points to mercy. It reminds us that kindness isn't about direction, it's about choice." Behind her, the photograph of the crates on the beach hung framed on the wall. Beside it in glass sat the original rusted tin, the one that had once held the bread. And below it, written in both Japanese and English, the final words of, "War ends when someone decides to feed the enemy." In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, the museum hosted a special event. Veterans from both nations gathered, the last living witnesses of the Pacific Campaign. Among them was Tom Whitman, now retired from the Air Force. Standing beside, he spoke to the crowd. "My grandfather once said that mercy was the bravest act a soldier could commit. He fed men who'd been told he was their enemy. Those men survived, and one of them became my family's friend. That's not just history, that's the proof that humanity can heal itself." The audience stood in silence, some wiping tears. Outside, the sea shimmered under a setting sun, red, gold, and endless. After the ceremony, placed a single loaf of bread at the foot of the memorial, wrapped in cloth. She whispered, "For you, grandfather." The wind carried her words out to the sea. And for a moment, just a moment, she swore she could see him there, standing in the surf again, young and alive, holding out the bread with steady hands as sunlight broke through the clouds. Jack Whitman stood across from him, the waves between them glimmering like glass. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. The gesture, the simple act of giving, had said everything that words never could. The ocean rolled on, eternal and indifferent, yet somehow kind. And as the lanterns faded into the horizon, their light flickering like distant memories, the world carried on not untouched by war, but redeemed by the few who remembered mercy. Because in the end, it wasn't armies that rebuilt peace. It wasn't generals or governments. It was men like Jack Whitman and who chose to feed instead of fight. Their story became legend, a quiet gospel of compassion whispered through generations. A story that proved one eternal truth. Even in war, the human heart can still aim toward the light.